Hello everyone, thank you for joining today's webinar, Telling Stories with Open Data. With us today are Kate Bender, Senior Performance Management Analyst for Kansas City, Missouri, and Tom Robbins, Senior Product Marketing Manager for Socrata. They will be sharing how you can leverage the power of telling stories with data. Tom, I'll hand the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Brian. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I appreciate everyone taking the time to join in for today's webinar. I especially want to thank Kate for joining me today, kind of bringing the real-world customer experience into what we're doing today. So, Kate, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I can. Perfect. So, thank you for joining us, and let's go ahead and hop into our webinar.
Great.
So I want to start with kind of what I think is an interesting story. I think that illustrates a lot of what I'm seeing, you know, on as the citizen side of open data, and in kind of talking to Kate as we were looking at building this out, I think this kind of resonates quite a bit. So for those of you listening, I'm a resident of Seattle. I have a son who's in school here, and the local school does provide, does maintain a levy and bond. So what happens is every couple of years they go out to the voters and they say, you know, hey, we need some additional money to help for technology in schools, to kind of help build out the better education. You know, unfortunately, they don't kind of publish, you know, what they're actually looking for within, you know, growing the education, you know, maybe increasing the amount of kids that are graduating high school or going to college. But fundamentally, as a taxpayer in the local Seattle, I'm very interested in kind of looking at this levy and A, making sure that it affects my own son, you know, B, kind of how much is it going to cost me as a property owner and as a citizen here. So I had reached out and I knew that they were looking at coming up with a new bond, and I had talked to some people at the Seattle School District, and they were kind enough to share with me the wonderful spreadsheet that you see at the bottom here. And I had said, you know, I'm trying to understand how you guys think about the bond. You know, why would I be interested in voting for it? You know, what kind of power and what kind of things is it going to help me with? And, you know, the spreadsheet, as you can see, while it's interesting, it doesn't really provide me any value. It doesn't give me any comparison. It's just a list of things, and it shows me kind of how Seattle pays for it versus other areas versus the number of students, the years that are involved, you know, and a little bit kind of in the other information. So when we start talking about telling stories with data, what we really want to do, and this is an example, so I spent a few minutes, you know, in my favorite tool, Excel, and I kind of broke this down a little bit, and I started looking at kind of different ways of presenting it. And as you can see here, what's interesting is as you break this apart by student, you actually see that Seattle has a lower amount of money spent per student than the outstanding areas, or the other areas around Seattle. That's a pretty powerful kind of simple. It doesn't obviously give me the whole story, and it certainly is just part of it, but as you think about how you're building out a story, this is a lot more compelling, right? So Seattle in 2010 was spending, you know, $750. In 2013, they're spending, you know, $1,000 per student. Whereas when you compare to Lake Washington or Bellevue, two other areas, you know, there's 3,000 and 5,000. So as a parent, that's a pretty startling number of amount of money that's spent. And then if you kind of flip it around and you say, well, you know, I'm looking at moving to this area, where would I want to live? Well, I might want to live in Bellevue because as you know, someone who has a small kid, obviously getting the most amount of money spent would be a huge benefit. So really what we're talking about is kind of the power of a story and how that power of a story can really make it easier for people to understand your data, and especially in the open data world where we're seeing the idea of these spreadsheets, and we'll talk a little bit about how this is starting to evolve, but it really is about telling a fantastic story that really kind of grows in your audience and helps them understand. When we talk about a story and kind of the power of storytelling, there's four kind of key areas which is how I think about, as a marketer and how I tell stories as a marketer. The way we feel, right? So I'm looking to compel change in people, and part of that is I want them to feel something so that they're going to give me an emotional investment. The way that we act, right? So they're going to bring energy to my messaging, the way that we think, and the way that we behave. And you start to think about, especially in open data, kind of ways that this is driven. I mean, a great example might be, real-time bus information. I know that, from a story perspective, I think it was LA who released their bus information, and they saved about $1 million a year. But part of that was the increase in ridership, right? So people had real-time information, so they were more interested and easier to take public transportation. You're starting to see kind of more emotional investment around things like 311 data, being able to provide that publicly. Now, Kate, I know on the Kansas City side with the KC STAT program, what kinds of things do you guys think about and when you start to tell stories, and then what kind of positive change have you seen driven from that?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to give an overall context from the local government side, I want to say that we've been kind of going down the path of really a focus on data-driven management in Kansas City, Missouri for the last 5 years. And you look at, okay, what are best practices in doing this? What are other cities doing? What's important? And you come across a lot of the same themes. You need to have good executive leadership. You need to have you need to have regular conversations with people. You need to have a lot of follow-up. But this point, the point of using your data to tell stories, is the biggest sort of takeaway that we've had in the last 5 years. You can be doing so many things right in terms of how you're collecting your data, analyzing it, how you're working within your organization with it. But if you're not thinking about how you're telling your stories with it, it's not going anywhere. It's not engaging anyone internally or externally. And for us, from a practical standpoint, that's been a lot of trial and error. We are constantly, in our KC STAT program, identifying the data is always the first point, and that's an ongoing iterative point. But what we found out is that the visualization and the communication, which are two words we use a lot when we talk about storytelling, are also iterative. So, we'll put up a chart and say, wow, that really grabbed people around that topic. We might put up another one and it is a dud. Everyone just stares at it and no one knows what to make of it. The way that, the person who's telling the story and the channel they're using to push it out, those are also really crucial. So, and I've got a lot of specific examples I can get into too a little later. But yeah, I mean, this point of how you tell the story, it's not like an add-on thing for us. It's the core. It's key to the importance of the data is how you tell it.
But it really is kind of the power of storytelling is how we're going to change people's minds about the data and start to tell better stories, right? Because we have a tremendous amount of data, I think, available, and then how we position it really helps people understand, how we're going to kind of move forward. And kind of capitalizing on that, I think there's two main parts, and I always call these story rules around the idea of how you build story. I think first is, and for those of you who may not be familiar with kind of marketing more in the private context, which I do think has a tremendous impact on the government side as well these days, especially as we move online, is content or your data is king, right? I mean, there is so much data out there, and kind of aggregating it. But if story rule 2 is really about collaboration is queen, right? So being able to get the data is one, being able to get the right data and then connect that together becomes an incredibly important part of telling the story. So Kate, I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about this idea of kind of data and then maybe collaboration as you guys think about building out KC STAT and how you work with other departments on the collaboration side as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I will say when I first saw the slides that Tom was putting together, I had to ask him. I said, "What exactly do you mean by collaboration?" I mean, I'm familiar with collaboration; it's an important principle to us, but I wasn't sure what he meant in this context. But when he started explaining, working with people to make the data better, to make sure it's understood, to make sure that the departments or your agencies are involved with it and on board. I mean, I thought another word that applies here is buy-in, really. And so for us, it's been really key. I mean, I can think of very concrete examples where, working with the departments to make sure that we are not only pulling the right data, but also looking at it in the right way. And, I remember once we were putting together a chart that looked at the relative cost of trash removal versus recycling. Trash being something you're paying a tipping fee to get rid of, recycling is something you're actually getting some revenue from in terms of selling it. And so we had these two lines side by side to show how they changed over time, those different costs. And it was we had a great buy-in from our solid waste manager. He wanted to tell this story. He wanted to talk about it. And he said, you really could see this better if you put the recycling on a negative axis, put it below the x-axis, because it's not a cost that you're comparing, it's revenue. And so then you see that the two lines, instead of, they're both going up over time, the revenue you get from recycling and the cost of the tipping fees, but what that really means is you have an increasing gap between the lines. Over time, it's a lot more beneficial for us to get recycling than trash, because the cost of the tipping fees are going up and the revenue we get in from recycling is also going up. So just that tweak to that chart, I mean, it made a huge difference in how it was received. You could really see the impact of our recycling program over time.
Perfect. Thank you. That's a great example. So if we kind of move on a little bit and we talk about kind of the value of storytelling. So as I said earlier, when I look at the idea, I mean, I've been a marketer and developer or whatever for a while, but when you start thinking about kind of the public sector, I start looking at kind of core marketing concepts, and a lot of that has to do with how you're telling your story, right? And part of this becomes what's called emotional branding. And let's be honest, right? So when I look at my local government or I look at kind of my local city, I have an emotional reaction to it, and I really want to understand how they're spending their revenue. And we think about in the private sector customer retention, but at the end of the day, either my city wants people to move in, they want people to be happy, they want people to pay fees, their recycling fees, they want them to be able to kind of do all that. And it really is trying to increase the brand or trying to make me enjoy my city better. And when I think about it from a private perspective, we talk about this idea of a brand, and we think of a brand as kind of a company. But we also, I think, can translate that into kind of my city or my state. And I think of that as a matter of perception. Am I happy with my city? Am I happy with my state? And part of that comes into, if I'm unhappy, I can get involved, and maybe get new elected officials. The other is, if I'm that unhappy, then I can actually move out of the city, and move to another area. So when I think about kind of this idea and lessons that we bring in from the private sector, and we talk about storytelling, I always have been talking to a lot of customers these days about this idea of starting to think about some of this in more of a marketing strategy, where you're starting to tell stories at a broader level, and then really trying to create a better perception. Now, I know, Kate, you guys kind of on the KC Stat side, you kind of help drive some of the perception for your area, based on the data that you publish. Do you have any kind of thoughts around how people should think about that, or maybe some best practices?
Yeah, I mean, we've really seen the impact that making the data personal can have. One area where it's traditionally an area that a lot of cities, I think, kind of grapple with their citizens about is snow removal. If you're in an area that gets snow or any severe weather, And we've looked at all sorts of data on it, number of citizen complaints. We looked at overall lane miles. We had some infusion of GPS technology to help make that process more efficient, and it's something we've been tracking. But the thing that, and then our overall sort of outcome measure is looking at how satisfied are our citizens by our citizen survey. How satisfied are they with our snow removal? It's been very stagnant over time. But it was the year in 2013 when not only did we have a couple of really huge snowfalls for us, but we really applied a communication strategy and helped put our mayor and city manager sort of front and central. They were on Twitter, they were talking with citizens, engaging with them directly. We had some creative communications around the snow removal effort that were pushed out. And we even went so far as to have our city manager ride along in a snowplow and take with our social media manager and take requests by Twitter. So snowplow Twitter chat. So and that had a huge impact. Our next citizen survey had the highest satisfaction with snow removal that we've ever seen from that point to date, and it's continued to stay high and it's increased. So yeah, that idea of engaging and making there be a story around a service area and the data you're using, we've seen how that impacts citizens.
I think that's great. A great idea for folks that are listening is kind of starting to build that out. And talking about kind of storytelling. When you think about storytelling, I always think about it as across a couple of different areas. Obviously marketing has a lot to do with it, kind of in core branding, but also fiction writing. And I don't mean fiction writing in the sense of let's make stuff up, but fiction writing as in creating characters that people can empathize with. So first and foremost, it is absolutely essential, I think, in building any story that you speak truthfully, right? Transparency and consistency are such an important part, especially when you're dealing with open data, being as honest as you can. And sometimes the stories may not be as good as you like, but kind of being honest about that. And then kind of infusing personalities as well becomes a big piece of that. I know that, in certain cities, like LA as an example, or a few others, the open data folks, have really gone out into the community and they've worked very heavily in things like hackathons and other areas so that they've created personalities and they've worked with how they can build out those stories. Boring stories aren't going to attract and retain people. I think Kate also pointed that out, especially as you think about snow removal, right? I mean, so Seattle gets, maybe two snows if we're lucky every year, but it's always such a major problem, clearing the streets. And I really care the most about snow removal when it affects me that day trying to get to work. You also want to think, just like any story and kind of fiction writing, thinking through the beginning, the middle, and the end, right? So where do you want people to start? Where do you want them to go? And then kind of what's the end? And, in my initial example, when I think about this idea of the levee here in Seattle, I think about, well, the beginning is, our students need money. And kind of the end is I get to go to the voting booth, and pull the lever, or in our case, kind of write in my ballot via mail as to whether I vote for or against the levy. So it's kind of that middle piece that we really need to think about to give me kind of the context as well as the characters that are really going to help me empathize with this story or want to become part of that story. And kind of a big piece of that is, how you tell it. So, we talk, about different ways that it can be told, and social media I think is a great way of doing it. Obviously, since we're focusing on data, kind of different charts and graphs and stories like that are such a hugely important part of that. So Kate, as kind of our expert here, how do you think about when you're telling your stories? Do you guys go through a planning process or an iteration? I mean, how do you kind of start to build some of these out?
Yeah, I mean, I think like I said, it is sort of iterative. That one important thing that we're always thinking about, starting about, is what what's the audience we're trying to reach? I mean, in many times that's citizens, but sometimes it's a mix of citizens and elected officials. Sometimes we're making presentations directly to elected officials. Sometimes we're trying to engage the press. Sometimes we're trying to engage internal constituents, our employees. All of those groups have different interests and knowledge levels of the data, and that really impacts how we show the information and which information we show and how we show it. And so that shapes a lot of how we tell the stories. And then, like I said, we pay really close attention to how the information we put out is received. Like I said, we have been doing this long enough. We have weekly meetings. We have monthly public meetings. We're very sensitive to the difference between, the presentations we give where it's just a dull thud and we think, gosh, people did not get that or they were not engaged in it, versus we've had presentations, we've had slides where people came up and said, wow, that was amazing. And so, we'll go back and say, what were the things here that grabbed people? What were the individual slides? What were the individual charts? Which aspects of this, helped convey the data in the most compelling way?
So, Kate, I know one of the things you had mentioned is kind of internal versus external. A lot of when I've been talking to customers, obviously a lot of kind of the open data aspects and sharing within governments, and we've had even some say as high as like 60% of their traffic is from internal. What would you do differently, maybe thinking about an internal audience versus kind of a citizen audience?
Mm-hmm. And that's what we have absolutely found, that the benefits of both the open data efforts that we've driven, but also the visualization. A huge consumer of them are our internal employees. It's that statement you hear that everybody assumes that in a local government everybody's connected to the same resources, and that's not at all the case. They may not be, or they may have access, but to get there is so challenging that people don't look at the same stuff. But I think a lot of what our group does specifically too is actually trying to bridge the gap between those two groups, between the data that's important to our employees and the data that's important to our citizens, and help connect the two of them. So for our employees, it starts with looking at the data that's relevant to them, that they feel like informs their day-to-day operations and tells them something about their day-to-day operations. And sometimes, our work is helping to build a bridge between that and what the external citizens see. So a good example is 311 requests. Well, 311 requests are a huge data set that's important to our citizens. It's one of their primary entrees into City Hall. It's one of their primary connections. For our departments, it is for many of them a very crucial set of work, but it's not their only work. And so, for us to balance between looking at the data from work order systems or other systems and how and what story that tells, and comparing it side by side with the 311 data set, so that but also emphasizing that this is the only perspective the citizen sees, the 311 information. They don't see all this other stuff you're doing. So, like I said, yeah, just trying to be a connection for the employees. And one thing also I would add is, from the employee standpoint specifically, we actually found that we were lacking a lot of data about what our employees thought and what influenced their work. And so we actually headed up an effort to establish an employee survey, both to look at internal service areas that they are consumers of, like HR, finance, procurement, fleet, but also just to look at the overall work environment. And that's been really important. And then we got to those places by listening to the employees and saying, wow, we're really lacking some objective data about a lot of the things people are talking about. So how can we get that data and make this into a stronger story than just, the anecdotes that are coming out?
No, that's great. Thank you. So kind of moving on, when we talk about the questions that you should be asking to build a story, we started talking, and I've been talking to kind of a lot of our customers as we're trying to build out a lot of how we think about open data and how we think about our platform and things moving forward, and really trying to figure out kind of what the key questions are, and then looking at how can we help our customers, and obviously the citizens and ultimately the users of the system around building out and understanding better stories. So the questions that we found initially are really about kind of what's the story and narrative. So what I always recommend is that people should start with writing out the narrative of what they're trying to get across, right? Being able to explain it in as simple a sentence as you can, and I always recommend people try to keep it below a page. Ideally, a paragraph is even better, but it depends on how complex your story your story is, and then also being careful of your language. So one of the things that we've seen is we have some work that we've done on the expenditure side and on the budget side, and as we all know, budget and expenditure are incredibly complicated when you look at the government, but simplifying that out. And it was interesting. I was talking to a Seattle resident a couple of weeks ago who really was talking through how impressed they were with some of the the expenditure and the budgeting information as Seattle's kind of started to come up. But being able to put it in a language that they understand becomes incredibly important. And then also looking at the stories that your citizens are already telling. Right. I think Kate talked a little bit about snow removal, but it was probably, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 years ago here in Seattle, we had a huge blizzard, and it was like 5 feet of snow, and there was a huge problem with the snow plows. I mean, obviously we didn't have enough snow, or we didn't have enough snow plows to clear off the streets, but the citizens really started telling the stories that, gee, they weren't looking out for the citizens. The local businesses couldn't open, and it turned into a pretty major PR problem for the local mayor. And eventually, obviously there was change that got brought into in the government, and it really is, an interesting thing to think about, considering that at the end of the day, that is a once in a lifetime or once in a 15-year experience where we get that kind of snow. And the other is to think about how much control you can realistically have. So whenever you're dealing with people at scale, you need to become part of the conversation and provide information, but it's not about controlling the story. And one of the things that we tend to hear a lot is, well, I don't want to make my data open because people may get the wrong idea. It's really about being part of the conversation and contributing. And we are hearing more and more people bringing up social media and having social media analysts available within governments, and being able to connect with those people, or being able to connect with the citizens at large and becoming part of the story. And these are things that are really part of the new digital age. And we're starting to kind of bring together how people think about that story. So Kate, if I could ask, go ahead.
I actually just wanted to add on to that piece about social media. For us, that's been, like I said, we think not only about how we're telling this story with which charts and which data we're showing, but also the channels we're using. And so our KC Stat meetings are public facing. You can stream them online. You can also go back and watch archived versions. You can download the presentations. I mean, at a glance, you'd think, wow, super transparent, super accessible to citizens. But when you take a look, you say, wow, well, the meetings are 2.5 hours long and there's 70 slide decks, So it's accessible, but, how much it's going to take a little bit of a dedication of time even to just glance through and see what interests you. So our communications group had the idea of live tweeting our sessions. And they've done a lot on their end to build up the social media following, our Twitter followers and everything. And it's been great because what they do is they pull out little nuggets of data. We help them, write up some Twitter content, but they sit in the meetings and they tweet those out along with little, charts, individual fragments of data that give a piece of information that might engage you more into it, but it's grabbing a totally different audience in a different way than our overall KC stat, because it's, they're pulling out information about, bicycle pedestrian use that's specifically appealing to groups where that's a big issue for them, and or public transportation, or any number of issues. So yeah, I think it also thinking about how you can repurpose your same content for different audiences.
And have you, and I don't know if Kate, you have any of this data, but I was kind of curious, do you guys have any insight into kind of which channels work better for different people? I know, like, a lot of times we see Twitter tends to work well for people under 30, whereas websites are more accessible. There's a contingent of people, usually kind of 40 plus, that like the video aspect. Do you guys have any insight into that, or do you kind of think about that when you're building your story?
Yes, we absolutely do. We have really good data actually on how our citizens like to receive information through our citizen survey, because that's a series of questions we ask, and we can compare their answers with the demographics we have from the citizen survey, which cover, age, race, gender, location. So from that, we know that overall, if the biggest bang for our buck is going to be our web. Our website is our number one, it's a plurality of people say, actually might be a small majority say that they like to use the website. The issue is, and you just covered it basically, that for us anyway, there isn't, one method that's going to work. We have our government TV channel that is the most popular among our senior citizen kind of resident group, and for them it's a really important source. For other groups, not as much. Twitter, social media, yeah, absolutely. Under 30 is where we find people there. So that's part of the reason that we feel like we have to cover a lot of different bases, is that we're not potentially going to reach our citizen base in a complete way unless we're looking at lots of different avenues.
Okay. No, I think that's great for people that are listening. Part of that is kind of reaching people in the language that, and in the locations that make sense. And I think it's always good to think that through, because I think you need to change your message based on that. So, all right, let's hop into classifying how we think about data stories, right? Because this is often the heart of what we're doing when we're telling stories with data. If you're not familiar with it, there's a great book by a gentleman called Thomas Davenport, who focused on, it's called Keeping Up with the Quants, who really focused at how you classify data stories and kind of creating a taxonomy that makes sense. And it's definitely worth a read if you're interested in it. But part of what he did, he later ended up doing an article on the Harvard Business Review where he kind of finalized it and kind of collapsed it a little bit more into kind of 4 dimensions of stories with data and analytics. And really what he was trying to do was to provide a way that people who are telling stories could start to think about how they're going to be telling their stories and being able to classify them, which makes it a lot easier, because then you could start building out kind of best practices and figuring out kind of maybe what charts, what graphs, what storylines tend to work. So I think that as people are building this out, you may find that this becomes a nice taxonomy to work within, but also it should serve as the base, right? I mean, you need to think about stories that make sense, but this becomes a great starting point. So he classified kind of 4 different areas, so time, depth, focus, and methods. And I want to spend kind of a few minutes looking at each of these, and then maybe showing a little bit on the software side as well. If we focused on time-based stories first, obviously this is, analytical stories. So you think about kind of past, which is reporting, and this tends to be the most common. So we really talk about this idea of, the past helps forecast the future, but it really is kind of the most common area, and you can see this kind of everywhere. Present, which is really about kind of surveys and stories, and then future becomes more predictive models based on the past. And these are kind of stories that are usually told within this idea of a time-based story. Now I know, Kate, that we can flip over to you, and you wanted to kind of show us a little bit about your time-based story.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you
Perfect.
see my screen?
We can.
Okay. So this is our KC Stat dashboard. This is where we show data related to all of the topics we cover in KC Stat, which our program is linked to our council priorities. And so you can see these kind of subheaders and then the individual areas. And so one thing I want to point out, people use or governments use dashboard type formats for different things. Some it can be very specific. You know, they want to show progress on a specific initiative or a really precise goal. Ours is really high level. You know, these council priorities are like improve street maintenance, reduce blight, streamline business practices. So the data storytelling for us is all the more important on these because there are some key pieces of data relating to these issues, but there's not one piece of data. There's lots. There's lots of things that help fill in the story on these issues, these really complex, involved issues. So I'm going to show you from the time standpoint. We have down here at the bottom under governance, we have several issues related to kind of finance and city administration. And I'm going to show you one that it might be just about as dull as you can get. And I hope I don't have any accountants or financial professionals on the line that are taking offense to this, but the pension system. So I already have this open, but basically if I click on this tile, it's going to open a new page for me that looks like this. And so the format of this, like I said, these tiles show a snapshot. Here's a piece of data related to this issue that's important, that tells us something. It also has a little assessment of where we're at, needs improvement, near target, on track. But the page is a lot more in depth. I'm just scrolling down real quick so you can see the extent to which you can delve into this issue. And it reflects the fact that there's not one data point that's important on the pension system. So the reason I picked pension for time, and this may be, so if I click here, this pulls down the chart over time. You can see the time frame over here. So anybody at a glance or in a newspaper article that's looking and saying, wow, the city's pension system is 83%, 84% funded, well, that doesn't sound very good. Clearly they haven't been doing something right, or there's a whole bunch of hypotheses you can come up with. It's an easy number to throw around if you want to be critical or talk about how things need improvement, which we don't, we wouldn't take issue with. It says needs improvement because our goal is 100% and it's below that. But the chart over time is what gives you a lot of context here. So if you'll see, here's the 100% line up here. So it starts, it's down here in the 80s, it's up, it's really pretty close to 100%. And all of a sudden, there's this huge drop. And what happens around this time? Well, obviously, this is the time, the beginning of the recession, huge market drops. Any city that has a pension system, I bet their chart looks just about like this. They all took a huge drop in funding levels, and that was because of the investment portfolio taking a drop in value. And so it's not to say that the city doesn't have ownership or a role or doesn't need to address this, but it's a really important piece of time-based context for a citizen to understand of how did we get to this point. Well, it had to do with the market kind of fundamentals during this time. And as you go down, and this page has a lot of text, it was a challenge to try to boil down some of these complex issues, but you can see some other really important things over time. So we talk a lot about how, we've fallen off on, and prior to, I will say, the current year, we just did implement a pension reform in the last year, which is addressed on the page. But, up the last few years, we have not met our annual required contribution. And again, that piece of information in a vacuum could be used to say, well, mismanagement, or, you could say a whole bunch of different things about that. But if you look at it over time, you see a couple things. first of all, is that we were pretty close to doing it in a lot of the years before the market fell out, and that's because after when the portfolio lost value, in order to make up that loss in value, our ARC went way up. The amount that we had to pay went way up. Did we pay less? Are we paying less now? No, we are at no point have we paid less than we did in the past. It's that required amount to make up the lost value skyrocketed after the value went down. So again, a piece of information that's tough to convey in speaking about it, that you can really see in a chart how the city has dealt with it over time. So yeah, Tom, if you want to take it back to the slides, that's sort of the point I wanted to make.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We'll flip it back over.
Okay.
All right. I think I need to show my screen. There we go. There we go. All right. So thanks. That was great information. So the other thing I did want to do is just kind of spend a second talking about budget, as you can see here. So this is a demo site that we use, and kind of from a time-based perspective, being able to really show budget to your citizens becomes very important, right? And we think about that, and this also kind of goes into other areas as well. But as a citizen, I'm very interested in kind of what the budget process is. And as Kate was talking about, we focused on kind of charts and graphs, but we also focused on the geography, as you can see here. So as I kind of roll my mouse around, I can see kind of different areas. And the idea behind this is that I can kind of go to a specific area and say, oh, I live here, and I can kind of drill into it and say, oh, there's a school going up. What is that school? What does it look like? And then as you can see, you can kind of click on it here, and then wait for a second. You can see kind of where it is in the process. So as a time-based reporting mechanism, it's another way of providing it. And a lot of the more interesting data a lot of times tends to be geospatial. For example, 311, we try to make this as easy as possible for people to think it through. And I'm going to kind of continue on here. Next is a focus-based story, where you're really kind of trying to tell the what, the why, or the how. And really this is kind of the more complex issues around what people are trying to do. And this becomes super important as people are trying to figure out how to address the issues. And kind of for me, the great example of this is, how do you address the issues of poor education? Well, they're addressing it by going for the levy, right? And when I think about the levy, they need to kind of bring me along in the story. So kind of telling this what, this why, or this how becomes an important piece of that. And we'll move on a little bit. I'm sorry, before I move on, Kate, did you have anything to add around the focus-based stories? I didn't want to...
No, I think I would just say, if you take a look at our dashboard, the tiles, I think most of them, this is the one that's really key, is that we're taking one data point. In some cases, it's a data point that's talked about exhaustively, but we're delving into what's behind that. What's driving that issue? What are all of the piece of data that build up into that or impact that, and letting people see behind that the one piece of data that's referenced a lot. So an example, street maintenance. Beyond citizen satisfaction with street maintenance, what influences it? Well, repaving, time to fill potholes, the number of potholes we fix. There's a lot of other data that's relevant to that issue. So I think that's, if you kind of self-browse through our site, you can see how we're pulling out pieces of data to weave a story about the big picture, data set.
Perfect. All right. So moving on to what's called depth-based stories. And it's interesting because these fall into very kind of two broad categories. One is what's called CSI stories, right? So the idea that we did a relatively small ad hoc investigation to kind of figure out why something suboptimal is happening. And there's some examples where citizens have looked into kind of open data, and they found that maybe the government isn't using their vehicle fleet the best, and they saved well over $1 million as they thought about that. And then obviously there's the Eureka stories, and these become the more long analytical driven searches to kind of answer a problem. And what's interesting about these is obviously that they're very long and they tend to be very expensive. And I often think about these, if you look at kind of the budget apps, kind of every capital project tends to fall into a lot of the Eureka story, because you have to think about ahead of time where you're going to build it, why you're building it, what the impact is. In Seattle here, we're replacing a viaduct, and they're building a tunnel. And there was a very long story about making sure there was no environmental impact, making sure that they were taking care of the waterfront, getting everyone to buy in, as we talked about earlier, kind of this collaboration and buy-in. And it's a very expensive story, but at the end of the day, they really do need to solve for the problem of a viaduct that's old and needs to be replaced. And really, when you start telling these more Eureka stories, you move into kind of more complex and analytical kinds of things. And typically, when you're telling a Eureka story, I always tell people to think about kind of the more drawn out story, right? It's not as simple as putting it in a single dashboard. You may actually need to have multiple locations. You think about kind of all of the things that happen as part of a capital project. And Kate, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I think that this for us is an example where a lot of times we'll be talking about a bigger issue like blight removal, but to talk about that effectively and talk about our processes, we have to delve in on one really precise, smaller data set that, citizens may be totally unaware of. And we did an analysis, a big change in process improvement effort around our initial inspections for code enforcement, which I won't go into all the details, but I mean, basically it was an opportunity to talk about the processes we improved and how they impacted citizens at a higher level, but then also give citizens insight into our process that they didn't have before by delving into that one data set.
Okay, perfect. All right, so our last is methods-based stories. And these are kind of correlation and causation, right? Correlation is really looking at a relationship, and causation really becomes how one variable caused the other. And these are very powerful stories, especially as you think about the government sector and interacting with our environment and interacting with others in our local area. So one of the things I did want to do, and I'll flip quickly to it, is if you haven't heard, obviously we are focused very heavily on redoing our platform, and part of this is really about the idea of storytelling, and a lot of the ideas that you're seeing today are being put into the platform. And I just wanted to spend a minute and kind of show you some of the metaphors and how you can start to think about, at least in this correlation causation perspective. And this is a very early prototype, that you're looking at here. But we've moved to what we're calling kind of the cards metaphor, which, as you can see, is kind of these windows that are here. So you can do things like, make a card smaller. You can kind of move cards around, which kind of makes it a little bit nicer as you're starting to build it out. But really where the power comes in, and as you think about kind of correlation and causation, and you start connecting, is this idea that you can start connecting things together. So for example, as I look at specific dates, you can see I have a filter range set up. I can start looking at kind of the crimes that occurred. I can look at the descriptions. Down here, I can start looking at the geographies. I can start tying together stories and allow citizens or kind of open data users to really start to think through how they want to connect these. And obviously you can start putting in filters if you want to kind of drill down. So it gives you the capability of kind of tying these things together in a very meaningful way, and kind of build that out. For the governments that are deploying this, there's a curation process, and we're trying to automate that obviously as much as we can. But it allows them to start to understand kind of the storytelling aspects of this, and then being able to kind of tie a lot of it together, which becomes kind of very powerful as people look at it. So if I want to know kind of in Chicago with the crimes data, what happened, during this specific slice, I can look at kind of primary, and then you can start bringing in other data as well. As you can see here, we now can recognize neighborhoods. So this becomes the idea that people can look at it and say, well, in this time range, there might be more, crime in this neighborhood versus that neighborhood, and then look at other causation data or correlation data to help try to understand that. And this is a big piece, and obviously we're going to be talking about it quite a bit more as we start building out our platform, and we'll be doing kind of more kind of webinars and things around that. So Kate, I think did you have some things you wanted to talk about as well?
On this issue of correlation, I think we had an example where we were looking at rat control, which is something we treat for rats, and if people report it because it's a public health issue. And it's not something, people mostly see it as, well, there are rats or there aren't, and I can deal with it by reporting them. What else can I do? Well, we did an analysis that showed a strong correlation between illegal dumping and rat control, and really just any sort of trash violation. And the reason for that is that trash provides rats with everything they need, which is water, food, water, and shelter. So we were actually able to develop an entire communications campaign encouraging people to, not create trash violations, but also address them in a timely way, and that could be a way that they could help prevent rats in their neighborhood. It was something we never would have gotten to, and it was certainly much more compelling to people than just talking about our rat control program. It was something, it put the control back in the residents' hands in terms of, here are things that you can do on a daily basis to prevent this issue.
Perfect. So I'm going to turn it back over to Bryant. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to send those in. Bryant?
Great, thank you, Tom. So it looks like we do have at least one question already coming in. This participant asks, what's the best story you've seen told with open data? Why was it the best?
I think that's a great question. Kate, why don't you answer that? I think I'd be curious to kind of hear. You're out in the field all day, so I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
I think our most, I don't know if I could say a specific data story, but our most valuable data set, the one that gives us the most aha moments, I think both for us and the public, is our 311 data set. And I've seen that elsewhere, other 311 data sets also, that it's the one that, you've looked at the same data, and I've been analyzing 311 data since 2007, and I did an analysis yesterday that showed like the frequency of tree trimming, that was side by side with through tree trimming requests side by side with the square, normalized by square miles, and it told me things that I'd never known before. So it's sort of the constant, like a never-ending stream of aha moments.
I think we have time for one more question. And this is, I've heard this one a couple times from the customers, and that's, how do you prevent people from misinterpreting data and kind of creating their own story from it?
So I think my kind of quick feedback, and then obviously Kate, I'd love to hear what Kate thinks, is a lot of times that's going to happen. And I think you have to accept that to a certain degree you can't control the story entirely. And you want to set the best story you can, and that you iterate through it, right? So if the message is out and it's not well received, and I think Kate had said kind of it's received with a thud, you need to kind of reevaluate and then slightly shift the story. And I think it's about telling the complete story and then kind of modifying it as you go along, and then adding more data as it comes in. So, and Kate, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is just in a basic level to have good metadata out there to explain what your data set represents and how to use it. Another is to make sure that it's that collaboration side, making sure that your stakeholders are all on the same page, because that can lead to misinterpretation even within an organization or even within like your stakeholders that you're working with. If not everybody agrees about the data or is using different data sets, you've got a built-in environment. And then the last thing really is data curation. I mean, what Tom just showed in terms of the new look of the open data system is something, open data in a spreadsheet form is very ripe for misinterpretation. Not even, people trying to be, trying to do it in a way that's damaging. It's just if they don't understand the column headers, they don't understand the actual source of data, then they're going to misinterpret it. But if you have good curation built in to help them understand it, I mean, that really reduces the opportunity to use the data in a bad way.
So it looks like we're just about at the end of the webinar. For those of you who still have a couple questions that we were unable to get to, we'll go ahead and follow up with you individually to make sure that we're able to answer those questions. But I think at this time we can return you back to your regular schedule. We're just about done here.
All right, well, thank you. Thanks, Kate, for joining us, and we appreciate you spending the time with us today.
Thanks for the opportunity. It was a great conversation.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone.